Okay, excellent. Good. It's lovely to see so many people. Lovely to be back in the Great Hall. I don't often get here on Sangha Night because I work, but we're on half term, so that's why I'm able to be here tonight. So yeah, it's really nice to be here. My talk tonight is called Reaching Out with Compassion. And for a while now at Sangha Night, we've been exploring, different people have been exploring the problem of dukkha, of unsatisfactoriness, which is a big part of all of our lives, of the life of everybody. Whether it's huge dukkha, like death or illness or a major life event, or whether it's just little dukkha, like losing our keys or having an itch or missing a phone call you really wanted to not miss. So these are all sorts of dukkha, unsatisfactoriness. So as Buddhists, the question is then, well, what should we do in response to this dukkha? What does the Dharma say about dukkha, about what we should do? And so far in this series, we've heard, well, there isn't just one way of responding that the Dharma suggests. We've heard about that we can respond from the perspective of wisdom, first of all. So we can use our experience of dukkha to help us see into the true nature of things. We've heard about how dukkha can spur us on into a heroic response where we marshal energy and strength and courage to in the face of our obstacles. And then a couple of weeks ago, Padmasambhava was visiting here, and he started to discuss a different approach, which was the compassionate approach, the compassionate response. And that's what I'm going to be opening out a little bit further this evening. And I was reflecting on this and I was thinking, well, it's very easy, isn't it? It's very natural when we're suffering to turn inwards. So I think that is the natural response that I certainly have had when I'm suffering. I want to kind of turn into myself. And I noticed that when so a big part of dukkha in my life is that I have quite poor health a lot of the time. And I noticed that when I'm particularly struggling with my health and feeling particularly ill, it's a much bigger effort for me to reach out and be present with people that I'm around. It's much harder for me to be patient with my dog, my piano students, to be patient when I drop my keys. And, you know, I don't deal with dukkha very well when I'm suffering. I become much more self-orientated and much more selfish when I'm sure that I'm not the only person who experiences that. And I think it feels like the emotional equivalent of like, you know, like little animals sometimes, like woodlice or something, when they're threatened or something, they just kind of go into that tiny little ball, don't they? And they like curl up. And I feel like I'm doing the emotional equivalent of that. Or a bit like, you know, like on an aeroplane where they say, like, if you crash, you go into the brace. Like it feels like that, like I'm doing a brace. And the idea with brace is that that's like the safe option, isn't it? That's what's going to keep you safe. And I suppose that's what we're doing when we turn away from the world, when we're suffering, is we're bracing, we're kind of protecting ourselves. And that's all very kind of normal and natural, but it's not very helpful. The Dharma would say that is not the helpful approach that we can do, because in that brace position, what we're doing is we're putting a very, very definite, strong boundary between ourselves and other people. We're putting ourselves over here and those people over there, and in that gap, there's suffering. There's extra suffering in that gap. So the compassionate approach is suggesting that we do the opposite of the brace. It's suggesting that we allow our suffering to connect us with the suffering of other people. That instead of closing down, we open up, we open out towards people, we expand towards people. And as we do that, we realize, well, other people are suffering as well. We're all suffering, and the analogy that was being used before in the last talk was that we're all in the same boat. We're all in the same boat. We all want to be happy. We all suffer. It's a problem for all of us. And so in this way, connecting with dukkha can be a real opportunity, a real doorway into empathy, connection, metta, and compassion. And this is what Padmasambhava was exploring. And then he also, in that talk, raised the question, well, that's the response then, we're having compassion. So then what? So what do we do with that? How does that manifest in the world? That's what I'm going to be focusing on, that bit of the question. And I want to start off exploring this by talking about Star Trek. because I love Star Trek and I never get to talk about it normally in talks. I used to talk about it loads, but I haven't talked about it for ages, so I'm really happy about this. Really love Star Trek, particularly Next Generation, so that's what I'm thinking of. And the reason I want to talk about Star Trek is because when, sorry, I get this, want to be with the people. When I was hearing all the stuff about the ship and everything, the boat and being on your own boat, all I was thinking of is the starships, because on the starships, they're on their own, up in space, they're all together, they're definitely on the same boat, like there really is nobody around them, like they're often light years away from the next being of any sort. We learn on Star Trek, we learn about Captain Jean-Luc Picard and all of his 2,300 crew, some of whom we get to know very well. And some of them are really good friends, some of them get on better, some of them get on worse. They're all very different, but still, they all know they're all in it together, they're all in the same boat. And in their adventures, they often come into contact with dukkha, maybe in the form of an unstable wormhole or some bizarre and dangerous spatial anomaly, or maybe some weird time loop, or maybe some Klingons want to kill them. Like lots of stuff goes on for them. And so they're definitely having the dukkha. And I was thinking, well, what do they do when they experience that dukkha on that same boat, on that same ship? And what they all do is they all act for the good of the ship to dispel the dukkha. They all want the dukkha to go. Each of them, as I said, have their own special gifts and talents. We've got the great commanding on the bridge, and we've got the engineers and all the things. And they're all doing their best to help the ship survive. Not even because they themselves want to live, although I'm sure they all do, but because they've made a commitment that they want all of their friends, their crew, their fellow crew members. Their commitment is that they will help each other all to survive, to reach their destination. And many of them die in this way, like they choose to sacrifice their lives for the sake of their fellow crew members. So although this is a talk about compassion, I promise, I also think that's really heroic and awesome. So like they're heroic, compassionate, heroic people. So that's Star Trek. So bring it a little bit back to Buddhism now, sadly. We have our own version of compassionate heroes in Buddhism, and you'll have come across these, I'm sure, Bodhisattvas. So even those of you who are new will probably have come across them in the intro course. So these Bodhisattvas, which means enlightenment beings. So these beings, very special beings, who've made a vow to pursue enlightenment, not just for their own sake, not to just alleviate their own suffering, but to alleviate the suffering of all beings. That is their mission. That's their destination. But the sort of suffering they're trying to alleviate people from isn't just like black holes and space monsters. It's things like loneliness, anger, despair, hatred, ignorance, things which are much more commonplace and much more dangerous, actually, than space monsters. And the ship that they're serving isn't just, a ship which has edges. These people here, my friends, my family, my crew. It includes all beings everywhere. Their compassion, their concern has no boundaries, it has no edges. It's known as the Maha Karuna, the great compassion, endless, spontaneous compassion. And the thing that creates a bodhisattva, which makes a bodhisattva, is the Bodhichitta. So the Bodhichitta, the heart, chitta is heart or mind, of enlightenment, of awakening, is a deep longing, a deep aspiration for this liberation of all beings. So something is switched on inside of a bodhisattva. Something's turned on, turned around for them, so that their whole life, everything about them, all their activity, everything about them is dedicated towards this end of alleviating suffering from all beings, of rescuing all beings. And in this vow that they've made, they find endless joy, endless energy and creativity. And they use everything about themselves to serve in this end, all their own skills and qualities. A bodhisattva doesn't look at somebody and consider whether or not they should be saved. They don't care whether a person you know, whether they're good. They don't care what they've done, what they've said, who they are, what they think. They just want to rescue people from all beings from suffering. That's what they care about. And this particularly altruistic approach to Buddhism, to things, is particularly characteristic of the Mahayana school of Buddhism, which maybe is a slightly later school of Buddhism. And it became to be known as the Bodhisattva Ideal. And the Bodhisattva Ideal is very central to many different Buddhist schools, including this Buddhist school, Triratna. And Bhante Sangha who founded this movement, he called the Bodhisattva Ideal the beating heart of Buddhism. So not something extra. It's the very, very center of everything. So you might have come across, in terms of bodhisattvas, you might have seen pictures or images. I don't know if we've got any here. There's one there. Vajrasattva's up there as a bodhisattva. Beings which are made of light, very beautiful, like green Tara, Padmasambhava. Yeah, like perfect archetypal beings. And those are bodhisattvas. But there are other sorts of bodhisattvas who have lived a bit closer to home. And some of us were here on Sunday for Parinirvana Day when we marked the death of the Buddha. And some of us were circumambulating the stupa, the kind of little structure out there that has the ashes of some Sangha members, and also of a man called Dado Rinpoche, who was widely considered to be himself a bodhisattva. He was a Tibetan monk who was the teacher, sorry, I keep wandering around, don't I? He was the teacher and friend of our teacher, Sangha. And he, Dado Rinpoche, underwent terrible suffering himself, being a Tibetan monk who was forced to flee Tibet when the Chinese invasion took place, and ended up in Kalimpong where he met Sangha. And his story is really amazing. Like, he was an incredible guy by all accounts. And he spent, by the sounds of it, like all of his energy really dedicated towards the uplift and education of, and dharmically and otherwise, of everyone around him. In particular, he established and ran a school for Tibetan children in Kalimpong. And you sort of think about it, and you think, how does somebody, I've got a memory of reading about him that he did so many things and then slept for like 4 hours, and then he would get up and start again. And you just think, where does he get all this energy from, this ceaseless energy in the service of other beings? And then when he was about to die, one of his disciples asked him, he said, Rinpoche, how am I going to know, how will we know who your next incarnation will be, like when they recognize the next Dado Rinpoche who's going to be born? How will we know who that is? And he said, the boy must have the same feelings as I have. I don't have ordinary feelings. I have continual compassion for people. And that is, I mean, what a thing to say. Like, can you imagine having continual compassion? I mean, just think about his life. Like, he had to flee his home, terrible sufferings and deaths all around him, so much oppression. And people weren't always very nice to him either, even in Kalimpong, but still this response of continual compassion. But this is the mind, and this is the attitude of a bodhisattva. And this is why people think of him as a bodhisattva. Because then out of this compassion, this deep compassion, arises this compassionate activity in the service of beings. So reaching out on the basis of dukkha with compassion, like the title says of this talk. And I said before that the figures of the Bodhisattva and the Bodhisattva Ideal is generally more associated with the Mahayana school of Buddhism. And those teachings were often seen as a bit of a later development. But I just really want to stress that this Bodhisattva Ideal was always present in Buddhism right from the very, very beginning. And you see it again and again in the Pali Canon. So the Pali Canon is the kind of collection of scriptures which describe the life and teachings of the Buddha, which are the closest that we can get to what the Buddha actually said. For example, I'll give you a few examples of this. There was the time after the Buddha's enlightenment, just after he was enlightened, and He was trying to decide whether he should try and teach what he'd learned to other people. And you might be surprised to learn that initially he didn't know if he would. He thought he might not, because it was so hard, so beyond words, so beyond description what he'd seen. Like, he didn't know if it was possible, and he just thought, that's going to be too hard, I can't do it. But then he looked across the world. He saw with his Buddha eye all beings, and he saw them as lotuses, and lotuses growing up out of the mud towards freedom, towards liberation. Saw that all beings had that potential. And it's seen that when he saw that, he trembled with compassion for all beings. He trembled with compassion. And then he said, well, then I will teach them. So then he spent the rest of his life, right up until the moment that he died, teaching the Dharma to anybody who wanted to hear. Really very incredible. Oops. Sorry, I moved again. Is this good? I'm so bad, sorry. I'm just like punching around the stage. And then later on, when he'd managed to communicate what he'd understood, and there were 61 arhats in the world, these are enlightened beings, holy ones. He didn't just say, well, sit down, have a nice time, guys. What he actually said was, I am freed from all shackles, whether human and divine. You too are freed from all shackles, whether human and divine. Go now and wander for the welfare and happiness of many, out of compassion for the world, for the benefit, welfare and happiness of gods and men. Teach the beginner that is beautiful, the Dharma that is beautiful in the beginning, beautiful in the middle and beautiful in the end, with the meaning and the letter. Explain a holy life that is utterly perfect and pure. There are beings with little dust in their eyes who will be lost through not hearing the Dharma. So that was what he wanted his disciples to do. And then there's the end of his life, which is just so moving, like hearing Savannah Garber reading the extracts from the end of his life. It's so beautiful because so much of his care and attention goes to those around him as he's dying, lying, sick, in pain, caring so much about other people. So he's so concerned that Chunda, who's fed him his last meal that's basically killed him, doesn't feel bad about it. He wants to make sure he feels okay about it. He wants to make sure that Ananda, his friend and attendant, who's sad and upset, crying, leaning on a doorpost, he wants to make sure he's okay. And then he turns to everybody and rejoices in Ananda, what a wonderful person he is. Ananda's like a king. It's so amazing what he says. And then just before he's dying, and Subhadra wants to learn about the Dharma, and Ananda's trying to shoo him away because he's dying. He said, no, let him come because he wants to learn the Dharma, like he wants to be enlightened, so let him come. So just constantly reaching out with compassion the whole of his life. So although the teachings of the Bodhisattva Ideal perhaps aren't as explicit in the Pali Canon, they're there. Like they're there in everything that the Buddha was, everything that he did, his whole life and his whole example, always reaching out on the basis of this compassion. So the Bodhisattva Ideal is pretty big. Some of us, sometimes I find that really exhilarating. It's very kind of beautiful, like, oh yeah, I want to go and rescue all beings, that's amazing. But then that's a bit overwhelming, isn't it, really? I'm going to go out and rescue all beings. And get a bit tired just thinking about it, really. And the reason I find it overwhelming is because I don't see the world like a bodhisattva. I'm not a bodhisattva. I like to think of myself as a bodhisattva in training, but I'm definitely not there. The Bodhichitta has not descended upon me. So I have a much more limited perspective than a bodhisattva. From my limited perspective, it can sound a little bit like running around being a cosmic social worker, trying to look after everybody, probably being very tired and stressed out myself, like tending to all beings. Because that's the only way I can look at it, because my perspective is limited. I mean, trying to rescue all beings from suffering, like I can't even rescue myself from my own suffering a lot of the time. But yeah, a bodhisattva wouldn't see it like this. And it's hard for us to imagine how a bodhisattva would see it. But luckily, we do have some clues to that, because a wonderful monk called Shantideva wrote basically the guide to becoming a bodhisattva. And he talks a lot in there about how a bodhisattva would think in this sort of situation about suffering and about reaching out on the basis of that. So I don't have time to say loads of quotes, but here's a few little insights that he has. So in the chapter on meditation, he says this: one should meditate intently on the equality of oneself and others, sorry, Edward, as follows. All equally experience suffering and happiness. I should look after them as I do myself. Just as the body, with its many parts from division into hands and other limbs, should be protected as a single entity, so too should this entire world, which is divided, but undivided in its nature, to suffer and be happy. So he uses this image of the body. So it's a bit like we're all part of the same body. And recently I cut my finger really badly here, and it was just bleeding everywhere. And the first thing I did is I just grabbed it with my other hand to stop the bleeding, to help my whole body, because you don't want to bleed everywhere, do you? So it was just, I didn't think I should use my hand and think, well, I must help my other hand. Like, it's just an instinctive action, isn't it, that you do. And Shantideva is saying that if we saw the world like a bodhisattva, that is the sort of response we would have to the suffering of another person. It wouldn't be like, oh, well, that's that person suffering and I'm over here and should I respond and I'm not really sure. We would be like, well, yes, obviously, we're part of the same body. There's no, why would I not? It would be as inconceivable to a bodhisattva to not respond as it would be for me to my hand to go, oh, well, actually, I can't be bothered because I'm over here being a left hand. So that's the sort of attitude we have, the bodhisattva has. And he then goes on to say, I should dispel the suffering of others because it is suffering like my own suffering. When happiness is liked by me and others equally, what is so special about me that I strive after happiness only for myself? I mean, it's quite simple, really, isn't it? But it's a very radical way of seeing the world, like, who cares whose suffering it is, sort of thing. I mean, going back to Star Trek, if the captain on the bridge would not think, well, there's a problem in engineering, well, that's their problem, I'll just leave them to get on with it. They would all be trying to do their best to help each other to solve the situation, because a problem in engineering is a problem for everybody on the ship. They just know that. And a bodhisattva knows that as well, about the world, about beings. A problem for another person, a being, is a problem, is just a problem. It's just suffering and should be dispelled because it is suffering, and that's the end of it. And this is why being selfish and bracing and all that is always going to be self-defeating in the end, and it makes no sense as a road to happiness. This is why reaching out is always going to be the best option. I mean, there are so many amazing bits of the text I could go on, but I won't because of time. But basically, what it's getting at really is that the impulse to reach out with compassion is the natural, appropriate response for a Buddhist, for one in whom any amount of insight has arisen into the nature of things, into the fact that we're all deeply, deeply connected in a way we can't understand. Once we have seen that, the only response is to reach out. So so this might all sound really amazing and wonderful, and you might be like totally on board with the whole Bodhisattva Ideal thing. But then where does that leave us right now? So you might think, totally altruistic response. That's the way, Dharmamayi. I totally get you. And saving all living beings sounds brilliant. But how are we going to do that? Like, how do I go around? Like, I can barely get my head around the idea of being continually compassionate to all beings. Like, that is blowing my mind. Never mind, like, how am I going to go around saving all beings from suffering? It just sounds totally mad and impossible. And I suppose the answer is, well, yes, it is mad and impossible. Like, I cannot myself go around and save all beings from suffering. I mean, the Buddha couldn't either. Like, it's one person cannot do that. And so the Bodhisattva Ideal is mad and impossible if we conceive of it in those terms. If we think of the project of becoming a bodhisattva as something that we do ourselves as we are, but maybe having developed into some sort of like spiritual superhero, like with big muscles and maybe a cape, and we're like flying around saving people, like, it can't be like that. But maybe it is possible if we conceive of it differently. And to evoke this, I now want to turn to my other deep dharmic muse, which is Harry Potter. And I want to take you to, sadly, the film, not the book, because it's an image that I want to describe, which is very powerful. And we've gone to the Half-Blood Prince, towards the end of the Half-Blood Prince. And what's happened is, by this point in the series of books and things, the forces of darkness, led by Lord Voldemort, who's a very bad wizard, for those of you who don't know about Harry Potter, he's grown very strong. He has many followers now. It's all getting a bit dark and threatening. And in fact, unbeknownst to other people, the forces of darkness have actually managed to penetrate the walls of Hogwarts School in the form of Death Eaters, so the followers of Voldemort. They're actually inside the castle, they're inside the school. And Dumbledore, who is the great, most powerful, good wizard, who apparently has the solution, the possible solution to destroying Voldemort, to saving the world, basically. The Death Eaters, they come and they murder Dumbledore. I mean, I couldn't believe it when I read the book. I was how could they kill? This is the way forward. How could, it's the moment, the most dark, I think it's the moment of most darkness in the whole thing. And there's this incredible scene in the film where he falls from the astronomy tower all the way, and he's landing. I mean, they don't show him landing, but and then they just show him, because I mean, it's a children's film, isn't it? He's at the bottom in this sort of crumpled mess, and then we go off and do something else. But then the film, we go towards him, and as Harry comes, we see everything from Harry's perspective, and as Harry comes towards the astronomy tower, we see the people from the school, the teachers and the other students, they're all gathered around the base of the astronomy tower, in complete shock at what's happened, this man that they all love so much. And Harry goes to the body, and they're all really grief-stricken. And then one person raises their arm with their wand, and there's a small light at the end of their wand, and it's so small that you can barely see it. Oh, and I forgot the most important thing, which is that after they killed Dumbledore, they cast the dark mark into the sky. So this is the mark that happens in the sky when anything really bad happens, and the Death Eaters are celebrating killing Dumbledore. And the mark is obscuring all the light from the sky. And then this one person, they raise their wand with this tiny little light that you can hardly see. And then one by one, everyone else raises their arm with their tiny little light, and then another tiny little light, and then another tiny little light. And soon they're not tiny, insignificant little lights anymore. The lights join together and they create an amazing, powerful force of light which shoots upwards into the sky and destroys the dark mark, completely obliterates it. And then the light is able to shine back into the school. And I just think that's amazing. And I think that the Bodhisattva ideal is like that. Like Harry Potter. Each of us alone, we can be a light of positivity, we can be a force of love and compassion, and that is no small thing. But against the sufferings of the world, it sort of is a small thing. So to really destroy the forces of darkness, we need to be part of a whole load of other lights. And then something can emerge which is so much greater and more powerful than any light on its own. And this is why the Sangha is so important when talking about the Bodhisattva ideal and about the compassionate approach to dukkha. We can't do it on our own, and it's not even helpful to think in those terms about it being about us at all. The Sangha was clear that instead of thinking ourselves as being a bodhisattva, as becoming a bodhisattva, we should think of the Sangha as a bodhisattva of becoming a bodhisattva, and ourselves as being part of that project. And a traditional Buddhist image for this, to come back to Buddhism again, is the Bodhisattva of Avalokiteshvara, the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara. This is a bodhisattva who has a really cool story that if you haven't heard, you will, which I'm not going to tell now, but basically he has 1,000 arms and 11 heads, and it's all in the service of living beings. And Sangha has talked about us thinking of ourselves as becoming a hand or an arm of Avalokiteshvara. So each one of these arms of this being is all reaching out, holding something different to help rescue beings. And he said that we can think of ourselves as like that. We can think of ourselves each being an arm of that body, helping the body as a whole to reach out into the world. And the wonderful thing about these hands is that they're all holding something a bit different. They all have different implements. So there's no one way to serve. There's no one single best way to be part of that project. You know, on the Enterprise, it wouldn't work if they were all captains or all engineers or all doctors. It only works because they're different, because they have different skills and they bring these different things to the table, to the ship. And that's what's needed here. That's what's needed in the Sangha. There's so many different ways to contribute to that project, you know. We won't all have the same skills. Some of us will be like really excellent at friendship. For example, some of us will be really excellent at making shrines. Some of us will be very, very good at making cakes. Some of us will be really organized at sending out emails. Some of us will be very, very generous and give us loads of money so that we can run loads of really amazing stuff. Like, there's so many ways to be part of that project. So we don't have to think of becoming a bodhisattva, of becoming a spiritual superhero, but maybe we can think of the Sangha of becoming a spiritual superhero. And all we need to do is just concentrate on becoming the best version of ourselves so that we can give who we are to that. So deepening our practice of ethics, of meditation and of wisdom, becoming as kind and as wise as we can. So becoming a really good instrument for Avalokiteshvara to hold. And the other thing that's important about Avalokiteshvara is that he has a central pair of hands here. And here they're holding a jewel, which is the jewel that represents the Bodhichitta, which I talked about earlier, which is that aspiration, that longing for saving all beings. So if we are holding our altruistic approach, that aspiration, if we might have it, if we've had a positive response to the Bodhisattva ideals for wanting, if we hold that at the center of what we're doing, if we have that in mind, if that is a guiding and unifying principle in our practice as a Sangha, then together we become the body that works for the welfare of all beings. And then together we can reach out with compassion. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So in a minute, Sachidoshi is going to tell us about groups, but I had a couple of ideas about questions you might like to talk about in your groups. So one question is, like, how do you respond to all that Bodhisattva ideal stuff? Like, there's lots of different responses you might have. Your response might not be like, yay, it might be some other response, which is totally fine. So it's really good to talk about that. You might like to also think about, well, if I am going to be a hand of Avalokiteshvara, like, what do I bring? Like, what do I bring to the Sangha? What could I bring? What do I wish I could bring? What do I long to bring? Yeah, so there's some things you could talk about. You don't need to clap that. No, don't clap that.